will read. I'll drop the link in a little bit. And then how might this look like in LA? We're gonna do a super fun activity to get our imagination going and really visualize how this could be applied out here in our city. Great, thank you. So first, I'm gonna pass it on to Carmina.
Hi, good morning. My name is Carmina. I'm a community organizer with the Community Power Collective. And before we start talking about the budget, it's important to know who the decision makers are at Metro. So the Metro Board is made up of all of our LA County supervisors on the left. There are 5. And then 4 LA City representatives and the 4 mayors of smaller cities. And this includes Glendale, Inglewood, Pomona, and Whittier. The current chair right now of the Metro Board is Mayor Garcetti. And then the first vice chair is Hilda Solis. This means that the next chair will be Hilda Solis once Garcetti's term as chair is up. And the LA City Mayor chairs the Metro Board every 3 years. The only member of the board that doesn't vote is the Caltrans LA director. They're appointed by the governor. Next slide, please. So a little bit of how decision-making happens at the board. First, there could be a quorum and majority vote, which is 7 votes. And then the 2/3 vote, it could be 9 votes. And then a 4/5 vote, which is for 5 votes, and it's required to send a committee recommendation to the full board. All of this totaling to 13 members, also like the LA County, sorry, just to back up a bit. The LA County Board of Supervisors has 5 votes. The LA City representatives have 4 votes, as do the small city mayors. So it totals up to 13 votes. Each member has a vote, except again, like the governor voting, the governor appointee. Next slide, please. So a majority of Metro's funding is provided from Proposition A, C, and Measures R and M in local sales taxes. As you can see in the pie chart, LA County makes up to 65 to 70% of the funding for Metro. So we personally fund Metro through our sales taxes. So Proposition A was passed in 1980, Proposition C passed in 1990, and then so on and so forth, and most recently Measure M in 2016. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we have all the spending categories that Metro proposes in their budget. Down to where the red box is, the transit operations. Transit operations is lumped together, including the policing contracts. Transit operations includes bus service, and the next biggest thing is capital, also like, you know, transit and highways. And then cities and other small transit operators is this funding for municipal, like non-metro systems, like Los Angeles Department of Transportation, the Big Blue Bus, Culver City, etc. Next slide, please. So Metro's policing contract is a 5-year policing contract that initially started as $786 million. That included LAPD, the Sheriff's Department, and Long Beach PD. Sorry, initially it was $646 million. And then when you added others like Metro's own security and RMI security, it ends up ballooning, right? And in 2018, they asked for an additional $35 million. So this has grown exponentially since 2017. And since the police have flooded the transit system, there have been more incidents with riders, including violent incidents. We have a couple headlines here, some screen grabs. I don't know if y'all remember when there was a young woman on the train with her foot on the seat that was violently removed from the train. Long Beach police responsible for over half of all metro arrests in July 2017. Yeah, so just a little bit of what's happened ever since police have flooded the system, and they're not necessarily preventing crime, right, on the transit system. Next slide, please. So Metro will spend almost $1 billion on policing by 2022, much of it in overtime funds. And just to get a breakdown of that on the day-to-day, this is around $548,000 a day spent on surveilling, harassing, citing, and arresting Black and Brown Metro users. And we want to uplift that Metro's riders deserve a fair, free, and police-free system. Next slide, please. So Metro spends almost as much in collecting and enforcing transit fare as it receives. So about 179 million. Metro expects to spend at least 179 million on policing on the buses and trains. And then every year, Metro collects around 284 million in bus and train fare. These numbers do not include costs like staff managing or tap cards and more. So where else does the money go? Proactive and dispatch policing. Proactive law enforcement means that they are on the station, policing activities such as loud music, etc., code of conduct, and fare. In 2019, Metro officers arrested over 2,000 people for alleged misdemeanors and issued nearly 22,000 citations. Together, these constitute over 9 in 10 arrests and citations. So just to show a timeline of where we're at, obviously, we're in 2021. The policing contract ends in 2022, but just to give some of the stuff that's happened since 2017. The contract was approved in 2017. Metro increased LAPD contract by 35 million in the middle of 2018. In 2020, obviously the COVID-19 crisis begins. And then Metro announced the creation of the Public Safety Advisory Committee halfway through 2020. Measure J passes in 2020 as well during the election. And just last month, Metro asked for an extra 111 million for the contracts. And then just recently, at the end of last month, or early this month, the Public Safety Advisory Committee members were chosen. And here we are. Thanks, y'all. I'll pass it to Osceola.
So in this next section, we're going to dig into our framework. Much of this is in the report. Some of what is about to be shared is also in a amazing report done by Mayan Dembo from UCLA, who I see on this call. So for folks who have read through the report, the first half of this piece is going to be a refresher. For those who haven't, this is going to be your audiobook version of the report. So based on what we've heard, we know that the current vision of transit safety is wrong. It's not the right approach. Police first safety doesn't work, and it has a racist impact on Black, Indigenous, people of color, families who are riding transit. On the other side, a lot of people, a lot of organizations who do oppose the reduction in policing, they say that they just can't imagine what the alternative would be. They can't imagine what would exist in its place. So here is our vision. Community safety through environmental design. It is a six-pronged, six-pillared approach to community safety, and it's a reimagination of safety from the bottom up. And I'll walk us through these six. Before we do that, just a quick summary. Where did this come from? This came from ACT LA, our member organizations, and our partners across the county. ACT LA has a body of transit rider members who came together with community organizers and advocates to think through from scratch, what is it that makes us feel safe? What are the spaces and the practices and the people that make us feel less fearful? And from that foundation, we built up from there to create these six pillars. And then each six pillar has a whole set of practices, policies, and approach that sort of branch off from it. So the next slides will be walking through these pillars, and then the section after that will be diving into what are some of the arguments that are being put forth in support of the contracts, and what does ACT LA say around those arguments. So I'll just read these off. I'll read them off. Rider-friendly active spaces, replacing police officers with Metro staff, programming, support services, multilingual public education campaigns, and creating well-paying jobs. So the first pillar. Next slide, please. Great. So the first pillar is all about creating care-centered spatial tactics. And this is focused on design and how we experience spaces when they are well-designed, when they are human-centered, and how we experience those same public spaces when they are not. So in this pillar, we're recommending that Metro continue to build off of some of their recent efforts. For example, Metro does have a customer experience report, and Metro has had conversations around centering customer service efforts around care and dignity. So those conversations, those efforts need to be extended. Also, a lot of this is about sort of things that we think of as fundamentals, or things that we think of as so basic that they often weren't mentioned, right? But that's not true. Things like improved seating, elevators, and bathrooms that are regularly serviced and cleaned make people feel safer when they're in an enclosed environment. As well as those things having visible and clear displays of the location, real-time data and other relevant information about transit departures and arrivals, and wayfinding systems. How many people on this call have been at the 7th and Metro station trying to figure out if they're getting on the, which line they're getting on, because the signage is so poor. So I know that's difficult for me. I can't imagine how challenging and frustrating that would be for, say, a young person with autism, or a veteran with a cognitive disability who's trying to get to the VA, right? I'm seeing some amens in the chat. Many times I've gone the wrong way. Absolutely, absolutely. Those things make such a difference for all riders, and they make a especially powerful difference for riders with disabilities. Building on that, replacing gates with easy entrances connected to pedestrian-friendly sidewalks, thoroughfares, and intersections. So all of those things are the well-designed, human-centered public space approaches, tactics that Metro could be adopting. These are some like bread and butter design things, but unfortunately they're often overlooked in the conversation around safety, when the rush is just to, let's go and talk directly about the police. No, we need to first talk about care-centered spatial tactics. Also, spaces for gathering, increasing the presence of people. This has been true for the millions of years that human beings have been on this planet, right? There's safety in numbers. So if Metro includes creative installations such as public living rooms, visual arts, natural lighting, plants, other greenery. All of those things create a more joy-inspiring public space and can increase the presence of people. That's right, I'm seeing more in the chat. 7th Street Station is impossible for the disabled, from Bobby Pepe. Pillar number 2, stewardship. Replace police with unarmed official representatives of public space who are Metro staff or work closely with Metro staff to maximize presence along high traffic corridors and stations. This includes roles such as transit ambassadors, trust agents, and station attendants or elevator attendants. So what are each of these roles? Let's dive in a little bit. Transit ambassadors, well, what are we talking about? So transit ambassadors are uniformed transit staff who support transit workers and riders. They're trained in de-escalation, they're trained in customer service, and they work very closely with transit agency staff. So this is something this is a program that's in place in certain transit agencies and jurisdictions, and it has been very popular with transit workers, meaning like bus operators, train operators. It's been very popular with them in promoting safety and creating sort of peer presence along the bus corridors and other public transit stations. A couple of examples: San Francisco Muni Community Transit Assistance Programs. So the agency partners with local workforce development organizations, and they hire justice impacted individuals. And that program also doubles as a job training program, right? An alternative to policing, but also a pipeline for workers who have been excluded from good jobs. So again, this has been a very popular program, right? Felt presence as past policing audit recommends. Trust agents. So the definition's in the name, right? These workers are serving as a soothing presence in public spaces. They're helping with perceptions of safety, right? Because the strategies are about creating actual safety and reducing tensions between people, de-escalating tensions, but also creating the felt perception of safety as well. So those trust agents are rooted in roles and responsibilities that build community trust and goodwill. So one example, Woodruff Park is a social work partnership in Atlanta, and they employ permanent case managers as park trust agents. And those park trust agents, their job, their responsibility is to connect unhoused individuals to services and provide basic necessity, things like care packs, things like power outlets. And another example, public libraries across the US employ permanent social work staff. They work alongside the library staff. They're seen as trust agents, and they hold down that specific role and responsibility so that it's not falling on others like the bus operators or train operators whose job is to operate the bus or the train. And it's not falling on police whose job is fulfilling a truly antisocial role, not a pro-social role, right? So these trust agents would, in public libraries, are helping contribute to the perception of libraries as a place of sanctuary. And we want to see that extended to transit. And last but not least, station and elevator attendants. So these are designated unarmed transit agency staff, and they have the role of holding down the stations themselves, holding down the station elevators. This is a program that's already in place. Transit agencies utilizing elevator attendants, for example, BART, MTA in New York. And there's a great quote from Latifah Simon, who's on the BART board of directors. She, in an interview about the program, about the station elevator attendant program, had this to say: you don't always need someone who has the power to kill to make a safe space. You need someone who deeply knows the interactions of people who are struggling the most and how to respect them. So when BART, and then the program costs $1.3 million annually to cover 4 stations, and this is again just elevator attendants. That program resulted in reports of things like defecation, graffiti, urine, things like that, went down in the targeted station elevators by 98%. So we have the solutions to the problem, and those solutions often and very frequently don't involve police. So the next pillar is all about programming. So this is about activating transit stations for their civic potential, increasing the feelings of safety and well-being by actively welcoming local commercial activity, cultural installations, and services. So how many folks have been in this chat, right, have been to a major station at Metro and in their brains have compared it to stations in other cities where there are things like street vendors and locally owned shops, right? I know personally that makes me feel safe when I'm waiting for a train and I turn around and I see that there's somebody selling newspapers and gum behind me, right? That commercial presence creates feelings of safety and well-being. And LA has such a rich and vibrant history around local entrepreneurism and street vendors, right? So this is part of the fabric of the city. And the stations and stops can be host stations to newspaper stands, small businesses, kiosks, street vendors. All of that contributes to a sense of safety. Bathrooms, again, this is jumping back to, and this is the next slide. We're also talking about programming. And bathrooms, also wayfinding to find local stops. We talked about that a little bit earlier. That is also part of programming interventions that create a better sense and a better reality of safety. Art installations, musicians. I mean, this sounds like, you know, corny, but it's not. This is part of a cultural approach to creating safety. So installations by artists can enrich the environment of the transit station. They can create a sense of place and community to what is often a generic infrastructure. And that makes a difference when it comes down to how people are interacting with others in the space and how they're interacting with the space itself. Spaces with art in transit programs that have been formally studied, New York, Buenos Aires, Naples, Vancouver, New York, have shown that transit stations enhanced by art and design encourage ridership, increase public safety, decrease stress, and improve rider experience. Along those same lines, musicians, right? And this isn't just in the, this isn't just, you know, art, musicians. There's just all kinds of ways, all kinds of programmatic interventions that can be de-escalation tactics, right? So for example, in Mexico City, there was a cultural intervention project on their subway that used clowning techniques to talk to subway riders about how to ride, right? And how to not be a jerk. So, you know, when the clowns would approach people and point out their bad behavior, like if they're crowding the train before others can get out, the confronted individuals, they would laugh, they would apologize, you know, they'd go about their trip. It was a de-escalation strategy. And the confrontational situation then became something that becomes a funny thing. And in another city, Bogota, there was a famous example where they adopted a traffic mime program and replaced traffic cops with traffic mimes in the early 1990s. So the mimes, they would mock people who were disobeying the traffic rules. They were applauding for drivers who were, you know, driving safely, and they were using drama, using mimes, using miming to sort of visualize the frustrations and challenges that we experience every day when we're moving through traffic. So that was a traffic-specific intervention, right? Did it work? It did. From 1993 to 2003, traffic fatalities dropped substantially. And it's interesting because these mimes are not only are they unarmed, right? They're not even using words. So there are countless ways to de-escalate situations. There are so many programs that we can adopt. Definitely LOL, mimes are scary. Right, one amongst many tactic strategies, but again, you don't always need someone who has the power to kill in order to make a space safe. Great point in the chat. This is LA. Lots of actors and actresses in LA. Yeah, let's put them to work. Good point. All right, so next slide, we're talking about support services. And this one is really important, right? Because we often hear as a justification for police presence on Metro, well, what are we gonna do about unhoused people who are using the trains for shelter? And you know, this is it's just a wrong, it's the wrong orientation towards this issue. And Metro really should do more around this. They're currently partnering with Department of Health Services and with PATH on a transit homeless action plan. But again, they're spending their resources and relying also on police-led responses to homelessness. So PATH is employing eight three-person outreach teams at much lower cost per employee than the 4-person LAPD team focused on unhoused individuals. For example, I think the number for LAPD hourly salary, it's about $130 an hour, right? So for far less at a lower cost, PATH is doing a better job, obviously, because PATH this is what they do, right? They do emergency housing and supportive housing support for folks who are unhoused. So of course, we are advocating for Metro to reinvest the policing funds into programs like that, including on-site health and crisis support. So Metro should absolutely conduct a review of Metro police interactions and arrests to identify where there are healthcare and service gap crises, because LAPD and Metro and police agencies across the country are confronting the reality that police officers have been given responsibilities they are not at all equipped to address. Acute mental health crises, social service referral, emergency housing placements. As BRU says, cops are not social workers. Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, cops often often escalate situations with sometimes fatal results where they could be responded to by a trained mental health interventionist who focuses specifically on folks who are going through that type of crisis. There was a survey of police killings. 1 in 4 people killed by the police have suffered from some sort of mental health issue, or disability. So this is a crucial issue around disability justice, and it's a crucial issue about actually providing the type of support services that transit riders need. So along with on-site health and crisis support, next slide, Metro can also, like we were talking about, employ workers who are truly meeting the riders' needs. So we can employ social workers, emergency housing experts, nurses, and doctors. For example, Denver has the STAR program staffed by mental health professionals and paramedics. Portland has a street response program that's staffed by community health workers. And Oregon's Cahoots program has been in the media constantly as a potential model to uplift since the uprising over the summer. And again, looking at our friends in the Bay, San Francisco has the street crisis response team that's staffed by behavioral health clinicians and peer specialists. BART has a progressive policing stakeholder engagement recommendations that are recommending interventions by staff personnel that are not police. And all of those folks, some of whom, those positions we mentioned in the earlier pillar. Next slide. Also, under this pillar of support services, Metro can and should repurpose underused spaces. So Metro, as many have identified in other organizing campaigns, is the largest public landowner in the county. There are so many underused spaces within Metro or owned by Metro that could be repurposed as satellite service hubs. And Metro can take stock of where they have properties like that along transit corridors and identify sites that can become satellite, or that can be used for satellite service delivery. And public parks, libraries, transit hubs have adopted that approach in other jurisdictions. And here are some more examples from Philadelphia. They have a hub of hope that turned an unused concourse into a full-time satellite office. The hub is located at a major transit stop, and it provides comprehensive case management, including primary care, free laundry, showers, housing placement, etc. So instead of adopting a policing first strategy of either client dumping or pushing people out, pushing unhoused folks out of the system, Metro can adopt what other jurisdictions have adopted, meaningful repurposing of their underused spaces to create real hubs for services and also triage centers, right? So jumping to the next slide. So I think we have a couple more. Yeah, public education, great. So public education. Metro can refocus safety efforts by bolstering feeling of security, encouraging riders to care for each other and see fellow riders as part of a larger shared community. This is a crucial pillar. And, you know, as all of us are mourning the horrific killing of our Asian American brothers and sisters in Atlanta, part of the public conversation has shifted to, well, how can we keep each other safe in public? How can we be bystanders who can effectively intervene in violent situations? And, you know, we don't have all of the answers, right? And I think that what so many communities across the country are grappling with is the feeling that there are approaches, there are solutions, and they're not policing. So how do we get there? How do we educate each other? How do we become more effective bystanders, interveners? And again, we don't have all of the answers, but in a transit context, we do see public education as having a huge role. And clearly those have to be multilingual campaigns. Clearly they have to involve bystander training. So Metro hosts obviously hundreds of thousands of riders per day. And in reality, it's the riders who are often intervening in situations and de-escalating violence or de-escalating conflict between riders and other riders, between riders and bus operators. So that should be supported by the agency. And that's another effective way to create community wellness on transit and invite transit riders to care for one another, to see themselves as a community. Again, that can involve and center de-escalation tactics instead of law enforcement presence. And here's an example from Boston, an anti-Islamophobia campaign at a Boston bus stop, emphasizing bystander methods of diffusing the situation while showing respect for fellow riders. Next slide. And last but not least, job creation potential. So all of the above slides, all of the above pillars can create good paying jobs, creating a care-centered safety infrastructure for both riders and operators. And clearly a big piece of all of this is sort of permeating all of these pillars is better service, right? If somebody's waiting for a bus for 15 minutes instead of 45 minutes, they're gonna feel safer. So better service would create more jobs in maintenance and operations. And prioritizing well-kept stations also requires regular maintenance work in cleaning and in general upkeep. And when we were doing some of our early thinking around Metro's sanctuary, and one of our members who had traveled to Japan mentioned that when they were at a Japanese subway station, they were just shocked because there were so many workers around constantly cleaning, constantly keeping things spotless. Somebody drops a piece of litter, a worker immediately moves to pick it up, and that made that person feel safe in that space. So that is a pillar that, of course, would create good jobs for workers doing regular maintenance work. And of course, better service would require more bus and rail operators. But also design and planning, right? So architects, contractors, construction workers, These are landscape architects. These are all safety. These are all workers that aren't thought of as safety workers, but whose work has a huge impact on whether a space is safe, feels safe, or isn't safe and doesn't feel safe. So new wayfinding signs require graphic designers, community expertise. Public education campaigns require marketing people. As we mentioned earlier, we're gonna hire Los Angeles's out-of-work actors and actresses as mimes. That's gonna be good jobs. It's gonna take a lot of hiring, right? And last but not least, local businesses. Local and micro business owners can see an increase in patronage given their presence at stops and stations, and given access to the public. And inviting locations for street vendors can also provide the street vendors themselves with secure, regular, and safe spaces to do business. Absolutely, street vendors should be allowed to set up close to all train and bus stops. So those are, in a nutshell, our 6 pillars. And definitely encourage everyone on this call to check out the report. This was an abbreviated audiobook version. Definitely check out the report. So next slide, please. Yeah, but, right, we're gonna walk through some of these sort of commonly heard responses, right? We put out a visionary reimagination of public safety. So yeah, what are the counter arguments? What do we sometimes hear in response? So here are the big ones that we hear, and we're gonna walk through each of these, and we are gonna share our perspective as ACT LA, and hopefully this clarifies, addresses misconceptions, etc. So yeah, but won't canceling the contracts decrease response time? Or don't women want more police on transit? And without the contracts, would bus operators be truly safe from assault? Aren't police helping unhoused riders find housing? So let's tackle the first one. We're gonna take a look at the San Fernando Valley for this example. Won't canceling contracts decrease response times? Here are all the bus stops in the valley. And one of the big misconceptions about the contracts is that without them, there won't be any police able to respond to calls for service. But let's actually look at how many contracted LAPD officers in the contract signed in 2017, how many were allotted for the Valley? So there were 6. And this is in the contract, the LAPD contract, provides for a little bit more than 6.72 total personnel per day riding the bus and in the San Fernando Valley. Again, this costs, was estimated to cost around $8,000 a day, $130 an hour. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about contracted police. But let's also look at what would happen, let's say something does happen on the bus. You're riding the bus in the valley and something happens. There's an incident. Let's say it's smack dab in the middle of the valley. And let's say that these are the contracted officers who are doing bus patrol in the valley on that day. So if something like that happens, in the way that Metro safety and security staff and Chief Green talk about policing, they talk about it as if one of these 6 police officers assigned to the contract are gonna then hop on the bus and travel over to that incident. But that's not the reality. In reality, local law enforcement agencies have the responsibility to respond to calls for service in their jurisdiction. And so if a call for service went out from this location, it would be responded to by whatever police officer is closest and can take the call, right? It's not gonna be one of the contracted officers unless one of those 6 officers is just very randomly exactly at the right place at the right time. So to give context, the San Fernando Valley Bus Patrol sector covers about almost 400 square miles. So it's like a huge area, right? So 6 cops aren't meaningfully able to respond to and handle calls for service in the San Fernando Valley as a bus, as part of bus patrol, for example. And I walk you through all of this, and this is a really important point. Local law enforcement agencies, they have to respond to calls for service in their jurisdiction. It's part of their basic responsibility, part of what they are supposed to do. And Metro does not actually have to pay for this stuff. And Metro actually can expect the same level of and the same timeliness of response to calls for service as anybody else that, or anybody else that has a space where an incident takes place. So for example, Starbucks doesn't need to contract with the LAPD so the LAPD can show up if something pops off at Starbucks, right? The same is true of Metro. So I say all of that to say that this argument around, well, won't response times go down, it's a little bit weak, it's a little bit misleading. And it's also, it pretends as if the majority of calls for service are about emergencies. So for example, focusing on bus again, because bus is the engine that carries the majority of riders across the county, right? Emergency calls last month received by bus patrol, there were 8. And there were a total of 263 calls for service across bus patrol. That's 3%, right? So if we're focusing our policy on the 3% of calls that are most likely going to be responded to, not even by Metro, one of the contracted officers, but potentially by a local law enforcement agency, just as part of their duties. We're ignoring the other 90%, the 97% of calls that are non-emergencies, the 97% that can be responded to by someone who is not an armed police officer. So next slide. Don't women want more police on transit? So during the uprising over the summer, and when a few Metro board members put forward a motion to reimagine safety on transit that created the Peace Act, there were some news articles in the LA Times, there were some quotes around, well, the majority of women, surveyed say they want more police. And where were those quotes coming from? Let's break it down. So the journalists who were using that statistics pulled it from Understanding How Women Travel. This was a report put together by Metro in 2019. And specifically, they were looking at 2 surveys. One, Metro's Understanding How Women Travel survey, and 2, Metro's Onboard Customer Satisfaction survey. But let's break this down a little bit more. When you take a look at that survey, the first one, Metro's Understanding How Women Travel survey, the participants that Metro surveyed were whiter and wealthier than Metro's actual ridership. For example, only 6% of bus riders are white, but 35% of Metro survey participants were white. Another example, 73% of survey participants made $25,000 a year or more, but Metro's ridership demographics are actually the reverse, where 3/4 make less than that amount. So unsurprisingly, when you disaggregate the next survey, when you look at that, which the next survey does actually disaggregate by race, when you look at that data, it actually shows that more than half of the Black women surveyed felt that there were already enough police patrolling the system or too many. So again, more than half of Black women surveyed felt that there were already enough police patrolling the system or too many. And that finding was even higher among the non-binary riders who were surveyed. Almost 2/3 said that there were already enough police or too many. And this tracks with what others have found who have talked extensively to riders on the system. Pueblo Planning did a series of workshops where they worked with women with disabilities, immigrant and undocumented women, unhoused women, the majority of whom repeatedly called for non-law enforcement strategies to ensure their own safety. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the community safety strategies elevated by those same Black and brown riders recommended things that we've discussed in previous slides. So, you know, transit ambassadors, or people who are hired explicitly to help mothers with children and the elderly to board buses and trains, or people who are explicitly there to address poor passenger conduct who are not law enforcement. So that issue, don't women want more police on transit? That line only holds up if you ignore Black women, and if you ignore what folks who are Black women, or if you ignore women who have disabilities, who are immigrants and undocumented, who are unhoused. If you focus on white comfort, then yes, you know, the majority of women surveyed will say that they want more police. All right, next slide. Okay. Without the contracts, would bus operators be safe from assault? So one of the important things that we do when asking ourselves these questions and responding to them is we take a look at, well, what are if there's an issue on transit, like, let's break it down a little bit. If there's conflict, if there's violence, let's take a look at what's actually happening. And in terms of assaults on bus operators, as we see here, broken down the top 5 reasons for assaults, and the number 1 reason is fare disputes. So this was a study that Metro's Office of the Inspector General did. They looked at the assaults on bus operators from 2015 to 2018, and they found that over half of the assaults stemmed from a fare dispute. And this tracks national studies that have looked at the same thing. And jurisdiction after jurisdiction, the majority of fights that break out between bus drivers and passengers are over fares. And the second top reason is a policy violation. So stuff like code of conduct, like somebody is eating on the bus, or somebody is playing loud music on the bus, and a bus driver confronts that person about it. So when we break down the numbers and we're seeing what's actually happening, we can actually push for an alternative that's not policing, that can get at the actual issue. And this isn't new, right? And in the next slide, we see that just really interesting story from Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C., in 1968, there was a campaign that was led by the bus drivers and ATU. It was in response to, there were almost 400 aggravated assaults that took place in a year-long period, and actually culminated in the shooting death of a bus driver. And in protest, the drivers went out on a limited strike for 17 nights in support of the driver. And what they were demanding, their main demand was for money bait to be removed from all of the buses. And this was because at the time in 1968, pretty much across the country, if you got on a bus, you could give the driver a 5, and they would give you change for the fare, or I guess you'd give them a 1. Fares were probably much lower back then, and the drivers would give you fares, right? So what the union was seeing is that this policy, the fare policy, was what was leading to all of this conflict between the drivers and between the riders, and it was also creating putting a huge target on the drivers' back, and they were being robbed for the fares on the buses, because they were constantly having to take out money to give people their change. So what the drivers fought for in 1968 was an exact fare policy, and for the money bait to be removed from the buses. And it was passed, the policy was passed, and DC became the first jurisdiction in the country to adopt an exact fare plan. And jurisdiction after jurisdiction after DC adopted the same. And the new policy led to a sharp decline in robberies. I want to read a quick quote. Here's a photo of bus drivers protesting, calling for exact fare. Here's a thank you put out by the ATU afterwards to riders and to leadership for adopting an exact fare. And I want to read a quote from, this is the International Vice President of ATU, who said this 40 years ago about operator safety. He said this: "Significant permanent reduction of transit crime is likely to come as a result of basic system change. No fare systems and the honor system are the kind of changes that need to be carefully looked at and tested for the possible impact on mass transit crime." So this was said, again, 40 years ago. It's from 1980. And we're still grappling with some of the same questions today. Well, what really keeps bus operators safe from assault? And in LA, it seems pretty clear that eliminating fares and going fare-free would be probably the biggest thing that Metro could do to lower assaults on operators. So food for thought on that question. And the next slide, aren't police helping unhoused riders find housing? We talked about this a bit earlier. So as we talked about, Metro has contracted with PATH. And again, PATH is a long-established homeless services nonprofit who provides homeless service outreach. But Metro has also contracted with the police agencies. As part of those contracts, they are also to provide homeless service outreach. So let's keep this is a pretty easy one to address. Which is more effective? Next slide. Here's an efficacy analysis from September 2019 to November 2019, comparing PATH teams to the police agencies. And the percentage of police agents, the percentage of contacts made by police agencies that received housing, it's 1%. The percent that received housing that were contacted by PATH, 27%. The percentage of contacts from police agencies referred to services, 28%. And the percentage of contacts referred to services that were made by PATH teams, almost half. So PATH teams are it's silly that we're even talking about and that people make the argument that police are helping unhoused riders find housing. Obviously, we need to advocate and organize around Metro, abandoning that approach to our unhoused riders, our unhoused neighbors, and push for more dedicated services, for more PATH teams, etc. And there was a question, are there any contemporary surveys or articles giving voice to present day bus operators and their ideas of transit safety? So again, Metro's Office of the Inspector General did a pretty extensive analysis about this in I think it was 2018 or 2019. And what they were looking at specifically was the effectiveness of those plastic barriers that are between the driver and the passengers. And the findings, they did a survey of bus drivers, and the findings were sort of contradictory. So on the one hand, the drivers reported that they did believe that the barriers led to a decrease in assaults, and that tracks with the data. The data showed that after the barriers were installed, there was a decrease in assaults on drivers. Those same drivers also reported, the majority reported that they didn't feel safer even though the barriers were in place. So I think that speaks to some of the contradictions involved when we're talking about safety. There's this tension between actual safety and perceived safety. And sometimes things that actually do make us safe don't actually even though we're safer, we don't necessarily seem safe. We don't feel safe. And some of this may be rooted in some of the way the doors are designed. So the OIG report was recommending that be looked into, the actual door design, to see if they can be made to not only reduce assaults, but also make drivers feel safe. Sounds like a classic case of treating the symptoms instead of the cause. Totally. And there's a mismatch. It's like the treatment, they're treating the symptoms instead of the cause, and the treatment doesn't even match the disease. So these contracts, it's sort of like prescribing like 5 years of chemotherapy for a runny nose. It just doesn't match what riders are actually dealing with. So from ACT LA's perspective, terminating the contracts, it makes financial sense. It definitely says, we hear you, to the families of people who have been killed by police. And it also, importantly, it allows us to truly reimagine safety on transit by creating hundreds of millions of dollars in savings that Metro can then invest in care-centered safety. So we hope that that gives you a good overview of the 6 pillars laid out in the report, as well as addressing some of the counter arguments that we frequently hear when we are talking about our vision for reimagining public safety on transit.
All right. Thank you so much for that. All right, everyone. I know we just took in a lot of information, but I hope this gave you a better idea of what this might look like in our everyday lives on the transit system. And I want to do a little activity with you all. What we're talking about is, it's big, right? It's really important. Safety is super important to all of us. We all want to feel safe. We all want our communities to be safe, our family members, those we love, etc. Safety is extremely important. And I guess what we're inviting you is to think beyond what we have been told safety is, and really think through what community safety looks like, where we're all safe, not just a certain group in our community. So that's what I kind of want to ground us in. This is the fun part, right? It takes imagination to do this. We have to imagine beyond what we have seen all our lives when we go out, what infrastructure looks like, what we grew up with. We have to be able to imagine beyond that in order to work towards it. We have to be able to see it. So I invite you all to do that with me. Next slide. In 2019, ACT-LA had an activation, which was really fun, and we tried to contextualize some of these things that you just heard, right? Some of our pillars, the 6 pillars. So what we did is we went to a station, and like most stations, most bus stops, most train stations, they're really empty. There's not much around. They're not a place that you want to really be at, right? And like Asiola mentioned, no one wants to be in a dark area sitting for a long time. So we did an activation where we made this like art installation of what things can look like. So we had street vendors. You can see the little paletas, paletero person there. You know, we had like a little shelter, recycling, trees. Folks, we did this activity with community members, and folks did flowers that represented their home country that they would love to have at stations to feel really at home and grounded. And not only is this fun, but it's really important, right? I think right now during COVID, we're all aware of how much our surroundings affect us. Some of us have the ability to take a nice walk and really take a break, and maybe hopefully breathe some fresh air and get some green space. And some of us live in areas where we don't have access to any of that, right? So Metro has a lot of power because it touches because it is public space. It is controlling public spaces, and it touches our lives in many ways. And if we're commuters, it touches our everyday more than once. Next slide. So yeah, we also did yoga, just imagining how we can even be cared for at these public spaces, right? Kind of what Asiola mentioned, the way you feel cared for at the library, right? As a kid, you feel really a sense of care at the library, and that is what public spaces should bring to us. Next slide. Just to contextualize how it is right now a little bit, these are bus stops, right? All around the city. And these are just benches, not thinking too much of infrastructure, but just benches. And as you can see, most stops don't even offer a bench for folks to sit on after being at work all day, right? Next slide. I want you all to take a second right now. We're in a webinar, so we can't see each other, so don't be shy. Close your eyes for a second and just imagine the stop either nearest to you or the stop that you frequent and what that looks like. Just think about, or maybe it's a stop that you used to frequent a lot as a young person, in high school, or maybe you use it now before the pandemic, right, to get to work, or maybe you're someone that's still on the transportation system even now. So what does that stop look like, right? Okay, I hope you all have a stop in mind, and most likely, or a lot of times, it's gonna look like these pictures, right? Which is just nothing. Great. As you can see, these are all stops. Can you go to the previous slide really quick? So it's like nothing. And then the next slide. Those are stops, right? That's where we stand sometimes for an hour under, you know, in all weather types at all times of day. Los Angeles gets pretty hot under the heat. All right, next slide. Yeah, this is a station close by. This is I want to say that's a dash stop if I look really close. It's just a little thing. You just know to stand there, right? All right. Next slide. Okay, so we're gonna do a reflective exercise, and if we were all together, if we were all in a room, I would be giving you right now papers and pens and pencils and even crayons, but I invite you with whatever paper you have around, whatever pens, if you are like me and you keep colored pencils close by, you can grab those, or even just in your mind. I want you to just transform that stop that you thought of and just think what it can look like. Maybe you're pulling, maybe some of these things inspire you. Maybe you think through some of the stuff that Asiola brought up, right? Like ambassadors and street vendors and trees and all those things. Or maybe you want to imagine even, I don't know, something even more out there and wild. I think don't get worried about rooted in like reality. I think it's just important that we exercise this imagination that we can live in the type of world that we want to live. We're not told that very often, but it's true. So take a second. I'm gonna give you 2 minutes. So just take 2-3 minutes and draw something. Think of something. So I'll be quiet for 3 minutes. I'm also gonna draw. And then if you need some inspiration, right here it says a space to dance, a space to speak, a space to relax, a space to eat, a space to catch your breath, a space to think, a space to reflect, a space to get warm, a space to meditate, a space to be, a space to cool down, a space to enjoy, a space to listen, a space to see, a space to learn, a space to connect, a space to laugh. So I hope you're thinking about it or you're drawing it out. And then once you have something, once you have something, just share with us in your on the chat what your space would look like, what your station would look like. Okay. You can keep going, but if you have some stuff, please share it. I'll start sharing mine, and then hopefully you all feel like you can share some words on the chat, in the chat. I thought of a stop on 8th Street that I often used to use when I was in high school, and there's nothing around, and it's not the cleanest area, and I mean, even during summer, this might be too much info, but even during the summer, I remember like getting like flea bites and stuff standing there. So it was not, it was a depressing place to stand, but I had to take that bus, right, to run a lot of errands, even get to my bus school stop, etc. So it was a stop I frequent, and I imagined it being transformed with lots of flowers, with a bench. There wasn't a bench there to sit on, and shade because you would get really hot, and having flowers and just green space and art. I personally think that art can be very transformative in the way you think about yourself and your community, and therefore your self-esteem, etc. And obviously green spaces are so good for our health. So that's what I transformed it to in my mind. And I've driven by that bus stop or walked by there not that long ago, and it looks exactly the same. So hopefully my vision can one day be there. So thank you all for sharing. I'm seeing trees, shade with misters. Ooh, I love that. Kind of like when you're at Six Flags, they mist you and it feels so good. Hopscotch for the children, trash cans to keep it clean that are emptied often. That's really important, right? Yes, I love people saying which transfer stops in South LA, Metro Run Street kiosk, and Ben's food, coffee, water fountain. I love that. Outreach workers, front house folks, good maps, lounge chairs, a little free library, a cooler with sodas. I love it. Shade. I'm seeing a lot of shade, a lot of green stuffs, parklets, obviously shelters. I love this. Someone that like gives information on the history of the neighborhood. I love that. LA has a lot of great neighborhoods with so much deep history. Some stops don't have seats and tables and vendors to buy food and drinks, a lot of street vendors, a lot of color, a lot of green spaces, shades, trees. I love that. Okay. Yeah, I love that street vendors are part of a lot of your vision because I think they play a really important part in this. And I mean, street vendors really make Los Angeles. All right. All right, y'all, this is beautiful. Thank you so much for doing it, for participating. I know it's a little sometimes uncomfortable, but it's important for us to just really put a vision out there so we can work towards it, right? And we hope that that is what this report does for you all and for all of us collectively. Do I have more slides? I think I do. Oh yeah, here's like a fun clip art stop. With street vendors, shade, solar panel, and trees and light and books, etc. Water fountain. Next slide. Okay, so before we close out, again, thank you all. I want to invite you all again, if you have not, to read our report. It really, Osceola did a great job at sharing highlights, but you know, there's a lot more there. And like I said, I think collectively, hopefully this report offers a vision for all of us collectively to work towards us as we, you know, work to changing what public safety is and our public transportation system. And then also for you all who are interested in advocacy work, there is, Metro is having its board meeting this Thursday. It's the full board meeting. One of the things that they will be voting on is increased funding to the already existing policing contract due to mismanagement and overspending of that contract. Actilay always puts out a toolkit that you can use to call in with talking points. So if you're interested in that, please let us know. We'll make sure you have the toolkit. So yeah, that is all. Thank you to all the panelists and thank you all who are here with us.